I'll introduce very quickly. Paul Gravett, I've known for a few years, maybe too many, well, many years, decades maybe.
Yeah.
Worked on comics, and he's an authority on comics. Published lots of books. He kindly agreed to, as he comes back from Kendal, where he's a guest speaker at the Kendal Comics Festival, which we'll talk about. He agreed to zip in and see us, and about a 45 minutes to an hour presentation. And afterwards, the people in year 3, or there's 4 or 5 of you doing graphic novels, will meet at 2 o'clock back in here probably, and then Paul can have a chat to you one-to-one. And he'll exit about 3:15. Okay?
Sounds good.
It's all yours, Paul.
Thank you.
That's my seat.
Yeah, I can start with some of the background of what's been going on down the road. I've got a bit of a cold, excuse me, but I'm not contagious. Lakes International Comic Art Festival. I don't know how many of you have heard about this, but this is literally like just down the road in Kendal, and it's been going since maybe about 6 years now, I think. It's always around the middle of October, and it is a really excellent festival. Very innovative, very international, and if you're interested at all in comics, you're going to get something out of this. It's a fantastic event. The exhibitions, some of them are still going on, but you've missed the weekend, basically. What were you doing this weekend? Anything really interesting? You could have gone to this, basically. It comes around again next year. Anyway, and I brought this is stuff I picked up at the festival, or that I'm actually reviewing. This is the new Chris Ware. You probably most of you know about Chris Ware. You know Chris Ware's work? W-A-R-E. Chris Ware. Anyone know about Chris Ware? Do you know about Chris Ware? Oh my God. Okay, well, we're going to have to start at the beginning, aren't we, really? Chris Ware, well, he won the Guardian First Novel Prize in 2001. That was a prize that was, not for this book, for the previous book, that was a prize meant to be for novels without pictures, i.e. a proper novel, a proper written novel. And there was a big hoo-ha when a graphic novel, won that prize. And he's an amazing, innovative artist. The things he does, I mean, it's a random page, the things he does with the page of comics is mind-expanding. It's not just like panel, panel, panel. No, it's going to have a lot of stuff going on in here that is really good stuff to learn from, whatever kind of visual storytelling narrative you're doing. Okay, and that is also worth mentioning, because here, a friend of mine, I lent this to a friend of mine who writes comics. This is, you've probably heard of Alan Moore. Alan Moore? Yes, good. He did Watchmen, as you know, and other things. We did Vendetta. This is League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is a kind of a gothic-y 19th century thing. God-awful movie. Did you see the movie? Wasn't it terrible? It just completely balls it up. Anyway, Alan is famous for, in this book you can see not only layouts, the rough layouts by the artist, but also all of the script. And Alan writes incredibly detailed instructions or recommendations, suggestions, he would say, to the artist, literally panel by panel, and that's an interesting book as well. Okay, that's some stuff. And then this guy's from the Czech Republic. Czech Republic is the guest country next year in a big way, but this year they had one resident artist who was there in Kendal for 4 weeks, and he's made a new. This is actually not. It hasn't been bound yet, staples. But this was the painted comic that he made based on his stay in Kendal. So that's interesting, and Czech comics are really interesting too. Okay, that's that. I'm going to press some buttons and we'll go forward. Okay, I'll just use this because it's the forward button here, isn't it? There we go. This is a bit of very, very brief intro as well. It's some of the books I've done. My first book was in 2004 about manga, and it's specifically my most successful book, actually. Translated into about 12 languages. And this book I edited, which was a guide to the 1001 comics you must read before you die. It is a useful chronology. It's very international. It's not just American or British. And you can probably find that perhaps in the library here or find it online somewhere. This book I did just more recently for Tate Publishing. I was hoping this was going to be a book that would open the door and I'd get a big show at Tate, because I'm also a curator. Hasn't worked yet. I'm going to this book. We have to break down the art establishment world as well as the literary establishment. And this is what did happen in 2014. I co-curated with John Harris Dunning show at the British Library. So 5 years ago, an amazing big show. Not a nostalgia fest, not a kind of I love the Beano kind of British comics exhibition, with a very edgy, subversive show, as it was called, Art and Anarchy in the UK. We wanted to show the subversive power and the controversies behind comics, British comics, all based on British Library's enormous collection, printed collection obviously, of comics. The biggest in the country, of course, because everything has to be sent there in theory. But they've never done anything with their comics. They haven't exhibited them at all, and we were lucky to get in there. And they have 5 bat caves underneath the British Library, the building of the British Library, just full of stuff, full of books, and amongst them a lot of comics. So that was an amazing project. That was a big success. And then, wait, I'll do this thing. And then, this is my most, well, one of my most recent books. This came out in 2017, and it's about manga and Asia, therefore manga-Asia. It's looking at the impact of Japanese comics on the whole region, as in Asia, but then also looking at the variations and other styles and approaches to comics that are also in Asia. So if you know about Indian comics or Chinese comics or Filipino comics, my God, there are amazing things in there. So that then became an exhibition. Started off as a book, and then as a book, as I was completing the book, the Barbican Centre. You maybe heard of the Barbican Centre in London. It's the biggest visual arts, performing arts institution in Europe. I've been told to say that. They have an international touring department, and they said we'd like this as a possible exhibition we could develop to then send around the world, which it's been doing. So Manga-Asia has opened in Rome, Milan, next Nantes in France. That was last summer. And then this year, meant to go to China, but China's super complicated, so we didn't get to China. It's going next to Bangkok and hopefully also to Taipei in Taiwan. And it will hopefully come to the UK, hasn't come to the UK yet. So that's my latest book. I have a picture of it. My latest book is a monograph about Posey Simmons. Now again, if you are writing some of these things down, I'm going to give you more information than you can cope with. This is an intense hour, but you might as well write some things down because even if you don't know who Posey Simmons is, you should. You should. For one thing, her Fred children's book was adapted into an Oscar-nominated animated film. Because it's animation. Oh, it's animation. I know where I am animation. Sorry, this is not animation, this is comics. Comics are animation on a page, but the reader is in control. That is almost one way you could sum it up. No sound, no movement. All the movement is made by the reader in his or her head. Like this. This is animation. It could be a wonderful animated clip, but it works beautifully on the page because the key thing surely about comics is that the images are fixed. The images are not fluid, they're not going to disappear, they're not ephemeral. We're all looking at constantly ephemeral images. You look at thousands of images all the time. Animation is part of that too. It's just a tide of images. And the power of comics, which is still so relevant now, is its narrative in fixed images, and you can look at the same image and a whole network of images on a page or a spread, and you understand these things are happening past, present, future, all at once on that one page. This medium is a very powerful one. Actually, more powerful. You might think, theoretically, that film, which has got sound, it's got actors, it's got huge emotions, it's got motion, all this stuff should make it incredibly powerful. But what it does is it works mostly on the basis that you passively take it in. What I love about comics is that you have to make them work. You have to activate them, animate them, perform them, direct them. They're not an easy medium to make or to consume, really. They seem simple, but they're not. But once you get into them, as I am obviously seriously into them, they are absolutely hypnotizing. They are fascinating because we can do so much. Just think about it. We do so much with pictures, we can do so much with text, with words, and you can put it all together and have it all on the page. So, I have to do this, don't I? Right, okay. What have I got here? Okay, I will whiz through some of this historical stuff, but I want to show you where things have come from a bit. The concept of comics began with this guy, Tupfer, who was Swiss. And he was a teacher. And he amused his students, as I'm sure Peter does here, with little sketches and scribbles about what he, adventures and jokey comics, basically. He was not a great artist, has to be said. His dad was a fantastic painter. He had eye trouble, so he couldn't really paint fantastically well. But he could draw, and also, at one point, he could write. And he decided to put these things together into these albums. This is from around about 200 years ago. And what he did, he sent these drafts to this guy, Goethe. Now, you may not know who Goethe is. Anyone know who Goethe is? Well, don't worry about that. I'm not going to talk about that. Goethe is a very important, famous German, super heavyweight intellectual, poet, academic. Not a barrel of laughs, has to be said. But on his last Christmas, you can see he popped it in 32, so in 31, he was sent the draft of this project by Töpfer, the artist in Switzerland, because Töpfer at the time was a teacher, and he was kind of embarrassed. He wanted to publish this, but like, you know, I'm a serious professor, I'm a teacher, I shouldn't be publishing these weird, he didn't call them comics, he called them pictures, stories in prints. But he said, I shouldn't be publishing this, it'll damage my reputation. So from the very beginning, comics were thought to be, you know, a rather kind of lower, some sort of kind of form that would maybe damage your image. But Goethe was very, very encouraging. He loved, surprisingly, actually, he loved this new form, as he saw it, a new form of mixing together extended stories in words and pictures. So the key thing he said is, if Töpfer did not have such an insignificant text, if he had a better story, basically, he would invent things which would surpass all our expectations. So Goethe, of all people, saw that this was a medium that was new and was innovative. Don't worry, I'm not taking you all the way back to cave paintings, for example. But obviously, we have an innate human need to narrate in pictures, basically. And once text comes along as well, we can do that, and we love this form. There are some chairs, by the way, down here, two just over here if you want to sit down. Right, so that's that. What am I going to show next? So it did actually he did publish it, Töpfer put it into a book, and it went on to become a phenomenon, pirated, copied, and also even published in America and in the UK in various editions. And it was the beginning of the form of comics as long visual narratives. We jump now to the American newspaper strip. Now, you may not know much about American newspaper strips, unless maybe you know Garfield or Powder Dogs or stuff like that, Peanuts. But the origins of these comics were that they were originally Sunday pages. They were put out once a week in full colour and on a very, very big scale. I mean, the size of a big broadsheet newspaper, not a little tiny tabloid. And these are, of course, free with the paper. And in America, particularly, they became a place where the melting pot of different people, all immigrants to America, to New York especially, who often didn't have English as their first language, could almost learn the language through the comics. It was like a way of learning language, a way of also seeing their culture reflected, because quite a few of the artists would also be referencing European sources. This guy is Winsor McCay, who I'm sure in animation terms you must have had him mentioned at some point, because he's the father of animation, one of them. And this is a dream comic, as in it's about dreams. It always begins in the dream world and always ends at the end of the page with Little Nemo here waking up. What's quite nice, by the way, here, this is an example where he's in this position in the dream, and then he wakes up in the same position as we come back to reality. And these are drawn in a beautiful, they were published, of course, in full colour. That's an example of one where Nemo's bed sprouts legs and walks across the city. And McCay had this big space to work with to be able to change the different formats. Clearly here you want a longer format to show the extended bed, so you make the panel longer. And he was a really important early innovator of comics in this big, generous Sunday page canvas. And here's him appearing in his own film as he's making, of course that's a joke drawing of course, but as he's making all the drawings for his animated adaptation of Little Nemo in Slumberland, which is an early masterpiece of animation. Right, well, I've got a Mickey Mouse picture here. I don't know what to say much about that, but that's Mickey Mouse, which of course became a newspaper strip as well. That's all right, yes, but we'll talk about that one. Yeah, another important innovation in early comics was to use woodcut single panel images and do them in a suite of images with no text and do visual novels. This is one by Franz Massereel, very famous one. You can get it's been reprinted many times, and it's often quite heavy, political, socially conscious, and they're worth checking out because as a design approach. Also, if as an illustrator, I suspect if you're a picture person or a word person, I think you should be both. You all should be both. But never mind. If you're picture people, you're okay. But if you're picture people, then this is maybe a way to think about it, because if you don't want to start, if you want to work more on your drawings, but I don't want to have to stick in word balloons or text, then this format of the purely visual graphic novel, the wordless, silent graphic novel, is a really good format to look into. It has a big history, great innovators going on now, making purely silent visual comics, and they're actually some of the most special comics, because when you do that, don't think it's going to be easy if you're not using words, because then you've got to get across all the information visually. The reader's got to be able to understand everything you want to communicate, and there's no text to back it up. But the visual novel is a great form, and it has a history, it has a future. Right, that's that one. What have I got? More Mickey Mouse. So this is one I've used for other. I'm not going to talk too much about that. But yeah, this basically Mickey Mouse moved from animation, of course, into comics and into British weeklies. It was the best-selling British weekly at the time in the 30s. This is actually new covers by British artists, and then of course it went on to become a newspaper strip and comic books as well. Now the big transition happens around the late 30s, when here you've got Beano #1, Action Comics #1, the first Superman, the first Beano, both in 38, and by that stage, comics have, through the newspapers initially, have become mass market products, and particularly starting, I would say, to younger people, should we say, not just kids, but certainly not seen as necessarily very adult or sophisticated form. But some of the comic strips were sophisticated; they were very, very good. But in the comic books in America, they then developed, particularly after the Second World War, they developed a lot of other themes, not unrelated, of course, to the fact that we'd all gone, at that time, people had gone through the Second World War, and so there were some pretty there were dark times, dark things to process. And one argument about the rise, particularly of, this happens to be crime comics, but there are also a lot of horror comics too, with pretty grotesque stuff, was it was actually a way for people to channel or exorcise some of the stuff that had been the nightmares of the Second World War through fiction, through graphic fiction, through comics. But these comics, of course, created problems, because at that stage we're still in an understanding where essentially comics are for kids, comics are for the subliterate, they're a good kind of training wheels to then get on and read proper books that don't have pictures in at all. And therefore, when these things came along, there was a lot of controversy and outrage in America, particularly against them. This guy, Wharton was his name, put a book out called Seduction of the Innocent, which raised a lot of alarm, and you would actually have public burnings of comic books. And this is actually set in a school playground, I think. And you can't see so well on the photograph, but the expressions on the kids' faces are heartbreaking, because they're seeing all their favourite comics going up in flames. And this was a kind of a paranoid, basically anti-communist, post-war America that was looking for things to blame for problems. In this case, particularly juvenile crime, which they thought was entirely due to crime comic books and horror comic books. And it's easier to do that than it is to actually deal with the real issues in society that you might have to address. Just find a scapegoat. And the comics publishers were actually fairly weak in terms of defending what they were doing. Only a couple actually decided to try and contest these claims. There were even nationally televised Senate hearings on TV where the comic artists and publishers were essentially on trial in the early 50s. This is an extraordinary era, really. This is the book I mentioned to you a moment ago, Seduction of the Innocent, which, I mean, you don't need to read the book, do you, really? The title tells you it's these innocent little kiddies have been seduced by these horrible comics, and that was basically the message for the entirety of the book. What happened as a result is that to avoid federal authorities, the state, imposing any kind of control externally onto the industry, the comic industry got together, more or less, most of them, and said, we'll regulate our own content and make sure it's safe, and we'll come up with an incredibly strict set of controls. Here's a couple of them you can see. This is the Comics Code had more controls probably than the Hays Code, which you might have heard of, was introduced to control film, Hollywood film. So you couldn't criticize basically policemen, judges, or any. It had to be utterly. Nothing could ever be wrong. For example, with a policeman. I mean, for example, that was one of the conditions. You couldn't present the details of any crime. It might encourage someone to do it, and you certainly couldn't show any females especially, with any exaggeration of their any physical qualities. So a lot of the potentially adult, more adult, less kiddie, less juvenile content was erased from comics, comic books particularly, and the whole field became fairly neutered. Especially here, for example, you can't even have any, you mustn't stimulate the lower and baser emotions. You must remain very, very proper. So this was a paranoia which didn't just happen in America, it happened here as well. I love this photograph just here, by the way. This one's going, oh look, this is a fascinating comic. Tales from the Crypt. And then kill. Should your child see this? So yes, it's just like, this was the National Union of Teachers, thank you, who were circulating an exhibition of American horror comics that they wanted to have banned by the British government, which actually did happen. And what's really awesome is they made a film strip, a kind of film thing that could be projected to go around the country to schools and to warn the kids about, don't read these things. And the story goes that actually most of these kids it did more to publicise these great comics than it did to actually put them off. So it didn't quite work as they planned. But the point is, what came out of this was a big hoo-ha in Parliament. A lot of positioning of Churchill was actually the Prime Minister at that time. He wanted to be seen to be doing something. It had weird alliances where the Communists Party of the UK got together with the Church of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury went to the House of Parliament to say, you must ban these comics, these are terrible things. So comics had some of the worst publicity in Britain ever that they've had. And this was, by the way, happening in many, many other countries across Europe and elsewhere. And the result was this Act of Parliament, which is still on the statute books now, the Harmful Publications Act. So essentially comics were harmful publications. They were just demonized as being bad. And that legacy didn't just end with this, it went on. Many parents into the 60s and 70s even have actually been preventing their kids from reading comics. It gave them a kind of subversive kind of frisson of edginess and anarchy, which of course we don't want to lose, but at the same time it did demonize the whole medium. So I'm giving you all this background because you need to understand how extraordinary the situation is now, how we've been able to get to the point where comics can talk about everything, and how you as creators can join in with this extraordinary medium and not have to deal with only working for kids, working within constrictive limits as to what you can say and show and communicate. The medium has actually blossomed in so many ways in different countries that actually it's more open and receptive to what you might want to personally do than you might realise. It's more open than ever. Pop art, obviously in the 60s, was the other way that comics became cool through pop art artists. This example is the Horses of Liechtenstein. That's the original panel Liechtenstein adapted and redrew. Frankly, the artist drawing this one panel is drawing much better than the deliberately kind of blockish kind of drawing that Liechtenstein does. Liechtenstein deliberately makes it anonymous and bland. He wants to emphasise that. But if you do look back and find where his images come from, you can actually see, well, there's some really interesting, good drawing going on in here. And that was only one panel out of possibly 100 or so in that story. And which one is art, which one is not art? I challenge you to think. The development of the graphic novel began as the development of the term graphic story. This is 64. It's a zine printed out on I think it's a kind of ronograph. What's it called again? Those purple sheet things. Very old-fashioned way of printing, anyway, from America. And Kyle, sorry, this is a really crappy slide, but that's the best I could get. Where is it now? Somewhere here. Yeah, here we go. And so, in future issues of Wonder World, which is the magazine, when you find me using the term graphic story and graphic novel to describe the artistically serious comic book strip, you'll know what I mean. So basically, Kyle, in '64, he was a fan, but also a dealer of comics. He distributed comics. He was distributing in America European albums. You probably know Tintin and Asterix. I imagine you've heard of those at least. And there's a huge wave of European stuff. He also brought over to America, he brought over manga books, which, as you know, are like a paperback 100, 200 pages maybe. And he said, well, why haven't we got these? We've just got, in America, all we've got are these little flimsy pamphlets, these monthly comic books. Why haven't we got these kind of things? And maybe if we come up with a new name, graphic story and graphic novel, we can get people to think of these comics as being something a bit more long-lasting, like a book, a story that can stay in print and be read for many, many years, not just a monthly comic book that then just vanishes into newsprint limbo. So that's where the term began. Also around this time in '67, I love this slide, this is Salvador Dali, who, as you know, is the bonkers Spanish surrealist artist with his big moustache. And he predicted, by the way, he was in a comic shop here in Paris. At the time in '67, the Louvre Museum has a department called the Palais des Arts Décoratifs, I think it's called. Anyway, they had a pop art stroke comics art exhibition, one of the first big shows in a fine art institution. And Dali was semi-joking, and he was standing, by the way, in one of the first comic shops, the first comic shops to sell old French comics. Here he is in Paris, and he says comics will be the culture of the year 3794. He was being surreal, of course. The idea that comics could be culture, obviously not until 3794, i.e. sort of something like 2,000 years ahead. Well, the fact is, of course, as we know, comics are culture. They're the culture of now. They are the culture of now. They underpin so many things, whether it's storyboarding, animation, gaming design, character design. Comics have influenced many, many forms, and they are the culture of today, I believe. Right, another little thing from the '60s here, which is a nice one. Updike. John Updike, famous American novelist, but also actually he was a cartoonist himself. He loved cartoons and comics. He wrote to all the great American comic strip artists, and he gave a talk in Bristol, which of course there's been many talks about the death of the novel. And he would say, actually, no, I think we could see another kind of novel coming along, which in this case is a comic strip novel. He thought that just needs somebody who's got the talent of both writing and drawing, or maybe, of course, a team working together, a writer, artist, and we could get some extraordinary things happening with illustrated novels, graphic novels. So there we go. And the key graphic novel that everyone more or less knows about, hopefully, is Mouse, because it won a Pulitzer Prize. It's a story of the Holocaust told using mice as the Jews and cats as the Germans. This is the earliest, an early version of it from an underground comic of the '70s. But then later, Spiegelman came back to the subject and allowed it to gave full freedom to tell the whole story. His first autobiographical comic was actually drawn in this kind of very scrapeable, scratchy, expressive style. And it's a style actually that Spiegelman initially thought he would do his whole book of Mouse in. This kind of drawing is very, very expressionist. It's very much like heart on your sleeve, I'm going through anguish. It's literally, you can feel the page being scraped by the scrapeable. It's like, kind of on paper. Perfect for a short autobiographical piece, especially one here where Spiegelman's mother commits suicide, and Spiegelman has severe psychological problems as a cause of that. But when he came to making Mouse, he decided to pull back from that over-emphasized emotionalism and to create a somewhat cool, somewhat kind of sketchy, loose approach to the drawing. Interestingly, when Spiegelman made this drawing style, he decided to draw all the pages same size. As you probably know, most people, when you're drawing, you would tend to draw larger, then it all kind of tightens up and looks wonderful when it gets smaller. He deliberately said, I'm going to make it the same size. And what the effect of this is, especially as it's drawing this kind of, almost literally, the same pen is doing the lettering and drawing, same size. It looks, frankly, when you see the book, as if you've got the one original book itself. You're looking at the artwork as if it's the original artwork. And that makes it very close and very intimate and immediate in the way you respond to this stuff. And the book became a huge success because it's the kind of subject, the Holocaust is not an easy subject to talk about in any medium particularly, but the whole idea initially of having cats and mice symbolizing Jews and Nazis was like outrageous, absolutely outrageous idea. But of course Spiegelman understood exactly what he was doing with this. Yes, go ahead,
I'm pretty
please.
sure they titled themselves as that though.
Pardon?
The Nazis would title themselves as cats and would label the Jews as
They did.
mice.
You're quite right. They said exactly. Yes, exactly. And in fact, they even used rat
Yes.
poison to kill the Jews. So they saw them. They actually saw the Jews as pests. Absolutely right. That's exactly why Spiegelman was doing it. And I think the impact of this book was wide-ranging because it didn't matter if it was a comic. The subject was so strong and was so well expressed. And Spiegelman also found a way to make the reader, the novice reader, because a lot of people are not used to reading comics. I'll just do a quick box. How many of you have read or are reading comics? That's quite a lot of you. That's very good. But not everybody, certainly not everybody has read them and got the basic understanding of how to read them. So Spiegelman made them deliberately very easy, simple, navigable pages. So there was never any confusion or complexity, and you knew where you were with the story. But along the way, he does cover things. Do I explain this to you or not? I could just explain this to you. I could explain one of the things he does that you can do with comics. There's so much you can do. It's just we could be here for a decade. The difference between this first panel here, which is set in the present, and this panel, which is set in the present, and these panels in between, which, as you can see, are set in the concentration camp. What's the difference? Well, the difference is these are squared off, and these are not. These are floating. They don't have as much of a clear, strong outline around them. But not only that, the way that the actual voice of the characters is changed as well, because in the modern day, we hear Spiegelman's father speaking in a kind of Yiddish English, but in the flashback to where he's speaking in German, there the language is more, is more straightforward English, because it's the way he spoke. It's his natural way of speaking. What things that you can do with this medium. So anyway, it went on to become a big success. Spiegelman probably will never make a book as important as Mouse. It's kind of hard to have made your masterpiece and then you go, what are you going to do next? But he's still a very innovative artist, but I did many things in comics. But he had a big show in Angoulême, the big comics festival in France, and then in the Pompidou Centre. The work is a phenomenally important book. I'm going to talk to you a bit about how the medium has also just become museumification of comics. Museums and centres for comics are all over the place, from one-person museums to huge archives and resources. I have been going to the Angoulême Comics Festival every year since 1984. I do suggest if you have even a bit of interest in comics, you should try and go to it at least once, because it's like the Annecy of comics, or the Cannes, or the Frankfurt of comics. And Angoulême also, all year round, has a fantastic museum and resources. It has a residency program when you graduate, if you want to try and work for maybe a few months or even a year, and it's all paid for. You can work on graphic novels in that residency. We have a thing called the Maison des Auteurs, House of Authors. It's a place where you can work in a shared studio space. It's the capital of comics, certainly in France. And that, for example, this is the Hergé Museum in just outside Brussels, a one-man museum. Okay, but there's been a lot of that. The fact is now the comics are in the museum. As you may know, this summer there was a manga exhibition at the British Museum. Anybody get to see the manga exhibition at the British Museum? Just you. Nobody else. You did. Good. Okay, a few people did. Well, it was an incredible exhibition, I think. They had 180,000 visitors, which is, I think, a record, they were saying. Just been an absolute blockbuster. And of course, there was a fair amount of bristling and unhappiness about the British Museum showing manga. Everybody's going outraged at this, but it had a big impact, and it was an amazingly inspiring exhibition. So I'm thinking what I'm coming on to here is I'm moving back from Mouse to looking at autobiography, which is one of the genres of graphic novels and comics that have become very important. And here's a French example, David B's from France, dealing with his older brother's epilepsy, and it's done in a very powerful graphic novel story. And this inspired, he was also a friend and inspiration to Marjane Satrapi, who, as you may know, went on to do Persepolis, which is the story of her youth and teenage years, but youth in particular, growing up in Iran. And this came out in the early 2000s, just after 9/11, after the Twin Towers, etc., and became, as a result, really a phenomenon, selling millions of copies in many, many languages, because it gave us a way to understand what was happening in Tehran, where she grew up, and what the Ayatollahs were like to live under. And she also went on to, this is the comics, of course. They were in episodic comics, usually in about maybe an 8-page or so series of chapters. And then when she turned it into a movie, that's the animated version of the same scene from the comic just there. And she worked with traditional animation, not to use digital stuff. The animation, of course, brought a lot more people to it, but to be honest with you, Marjan says herself, really, it's the book, it's the real thing. The animation was fine. The animation doesn't do what the book does, because it has to have a big arc, you have to be following one story, it can't be quite as complex as the comic can be. But of course it works in its own way, very, very well. Okay, I'm showing Alan Moore. I've mentioned to you before, for example, from the League. In the UK, Alan Moore's undoubtedly been the most influential comics writer. And we're talking about this because Alan is a very visual writer. He knows what he wants to see on the page, as you've seen from these detailed scripts that I was showing you earlier. And he is a very good artist in himself, actually, but he just takes a bit too much time. He's a bit slow. But he loves collaborating with artists. He doesn't write scripts as a kind of set of commands that you have to do, or exactly what he says, but he wants to work with an artist and really collaborate and get the best possible combination out of them. And working with David Lloyd on V for Vendetta resulted in one of the most important, strong political comics produced during the Thatcher era, which fortunately many of you here didn't experience, but we're kind of experiencing a kind of second Thatcher era perhaps at the moment in the UK. But anyway, at the time, Moore and Lloyd wanted to imagine a kind of nightmare near future of what Thatcherism could lead to literally to a complete suppression of individual rights. So we created this tremendous series. And as you know, the V character, the mask based, of course, on the Guy Fawkes mask, has become a big symbol of Occupy and of protests around the world. Even actually, I just saw recently there were some people wearing these masks in Hong Kong, for example. So yeah, that's a very important book. And Moore really loves the 9-panel grid, as you know maybe from Watchmen. If you've read Watchmen, that's in this 9-panel waffle, as it's called, waffle grid, where it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like this. And the reason for that format being so good, obviously rarely you can have extra wide panels sometimes, but if you have that underpinning pulse of like a metronome of picture, 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 and it's going through in a very studied, sort of controlled way, then that means you haven't got to worry about the shape or size of the panels so much. You decide on how you compose the panels. And also when you look at the page, you see the whole page as a whole. And then you can start to go inside the page, because of course it has this lovely structure to it. So it's become a kind of, one of the tropes of graphic novels is to use these strict grids to create the comics. Now, one of the other areas that's developed was autobiography and dystopian fictions of this sort, and the ambitions of Alan Moore's and others has been cartoon journalism, as it's called. Joe Sacco is Maltese by birth, American now, and he wanted to go and find out what's happening on the ground in Palestine, the stuff that wasn't getting into the newspapers or onto TV. And I think we all know by now that we only get a certain tiny window of the real truth of what's happening through your so-called mass media and news and stuff. And really you need to go and talk to people and find out what's really happening. And Joe went out there, he combines pictures of himself, with all that's in here, and here, with the people he meets, and then he draws very super detailed environments as well, actually, and locations when he went out there, and talks to the people who often simply don't get a chance to be heard at all. And it produced, of course, a tremendous impact. He's gone on to do stories in Serbia and Bosnia during those wars. He has pioneered a kind of graphic reportage journalism approach, which can be applied to anything. You haven't got to go to a conflict zone like Palestine, for example, or anywhere else. You could do something about what's happening here in Preston, if there's an important story, an environmental one, or maybe a social one, maybe deprivation. So comic artists are getting much more involved with issues, with stories that need to be told, and because these stories sometimes can be conveyed much more powerfully and accessibly than if they're just, say, in a film or a newspaper report or something. Perhaps partly because they are drawn. The drawing itself actually makes them individualistic and human. It's not camera and film, which looks like almost anybody could do it. Right. But speaking of photography, this is sorry, it's not at the bottom here. It's called The Photographer. It's an amazing graphic novel, really, really amazing, because the artist met this photographer who had been in Afghanistan with a bunch of doctors trying to bring care to both sides of the conflict there. And the photographer came back with thousands of photographs. They took so many amazing photographs, really amazing. But only like maybe 4 or 5 made it into print. They weren't used. And when the artist got to meet the photographer, and learned the whole story of what happened, not just photographs, but also what happened to him, the photographer himself, of the trauma he had of dealing with this experience. He said, well, let's use your photographs. Let's put the photographs in. Literally, the contact sheets here are used as panels, and then whatever you haven't photographed, I will draw the stuff you didn't photograph. And it became a really remarkable document. And an example of how you can combine photographs with comics, which I believe is, that's a whole other area which I'm convinced we have yet to see the masterpieces of. And maybe somebody in this audience is going to make the masterpiece of photographic comics, because my God, we need one. Why aren't photographers making comics? What's the matter with you? Honestly, it's because, just like illustrators, I want to make a lovely single image which tells a whole story. No, why am I making 50 or 100 and tell a story? There are a few photographers are making comics, but not enough of them. So one of my several projects for the next 10 years is to eventually do an interesting exhibition and commission and make a show that shows the photography and comics can really work together and not turn out looking like Jackie and My Guy and Viz. Much as I love all those really cheesy romance comics, but we all know that they look really, they're naff, aren't they? But fun. But there must be a way of doing them well, and that has to be done. Right. And then in terms of other reportage comics, this is Kate Evans, who went over to the jungle, the refugee camp in Calais, and was able to really meet people, as opposed to a camera crew coming in and people not. She was able to get on one-to-one, intimately, and find out what their lives and their stories were about. Put them into a beautiful graphic novel, which she, as it's set of course in Calais. Calais is famous for lace making. The comic is called Threads, and she used pieces of lace between the panels to kind of join the panels together. It's a nice touch, I think. And then in terms of other kinds of subjects, we've got this is a gay artist, Howard Cruz, who was drawing in the 70s, and now more recently has done this graphic novel which deals with not only gay rights but also black civil rights. So it's a mixture, the junction of the two. Really great story, partly autobiographical, but mostly actually fiction. And that's just about to be re-released. That's a great book. You may have heard of Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. She's a lesbian cartoonist who did a story about her family, and particularly about her father. She's done another one called Are You My Mother, about her mother. And these are fantastic books. And in fact, Fun Home went on to become a Broadway musical, which, if you told me that, I couldn't believe it was going to happen, but it's been a very successful crossover into theatre. That's a page from that. And then, just in terms of diversity, my God, we need diversity in comics. I mean, we need it in everything. Every medium, as we know, is basically white and male and straight and dull, and everybody is just the same. And you have to somehow inject the bigger diversity of real life, the plurality of real life, hopefully through the creators and the content of comics somehow. And that has been happening a lot, at least since the 70s. And we have, for example, here Margaret Abaway, who is a writer from the Ivory Coast, here making stories with an artist about her life, and showing us a part of Africa and a kind of Africa that we hardly ever get to experience in any media, really. Maybe in movies, perhaps a bit, but in other words, not just the usual tragic Africa, but a hopeful and fully fascinating And this is a Chinese-American artist, Jean Yang, who's done a story called American-Born Chinese, which deals with the prejudice that he experienced as a Chinese guy in school. And it's been a big success for the American for him. Right, that's that. Right. Right. So diversity, very, very important. I hope we get more of that. Now, I'm going to talk to you about an artist here who I mentioned earlier. I think I mentioned, did I? Maybe I didn't. Her name is Posy Simmons. I didn't I? Posy Simmons, that's S-I-M-M-O-S, you see there. She is 74. She's been drawing since the late 60s. I've just done a book about her, the first book ever about Posy's work. And she is doing stuff with comics that nobody else is doing. And it's made, I have a funny thing, this might not necessarily appeal to all of you, because as you can see for a start here, there's quite a lot of text on these pages. In fact, if we go into this page on the left just a bit more closely here, but Posy has introduced the use of text, narrative text, literary, novelistic text, onto the comics page. More than anybody else, she's figured out how to move between completely, almost pictureless text. In that sense, this is the narrator, this is his narration. We go here, for example, to the character's diary. We can then go to completely visual storytelling, as she's remembering her sexy liaison with her French lover. And then we have a character, we have a message arrive, and she's reading the message. This is the message here. More narration over here from the diary. And then as the page completes, we have another sequence of comic panels, and then another sequence here with no words, because this is the perfect way to show the inner turmoil and her resolve to somehow get through this. Now, I'm showing that in brief form, but the point is that this is actually a form of comics that hasn't existed before. Not really, not combining text narration in this way, because sometimes the best way to express something is in pictures. If you try to write those 4 panels in text form, it would be really pathetic. You'd have to say, and then Gemma Bovary put her hand to her face and felt really full of turmoil, but decided that she would somehow get through it all and she would be okay. Well, that's crap, isn't it, as writing? But showing it purely in pictures, you know from what's happened what she's thinking. And similarly, other parts of this book, you could spend possibly 5 or 6 pages trying to visualize what she's narrating in text. The text gets on with the parts of the story that you don't necessarily want to draw. Now, I think you're all very visual people. You need to be verbal as well. You really do, because this is the language, it's pictures and words. You can do it without words, but if you realize the power of words here, my gosh, you can do a lot with both. Anyway, that's just an example of how another form of comics evolving as we speak. Chris Ware, I mentioned Chris Ware. You really didn't know who Chris Ware was, did you? Have you really not heard of Chris Ware? Okay, well, that's good. Just find out about him, because he's done so much to innovate the comics page. He's done some animation stuff as well, which is very, very good. But one of the things he does is, well, it's going to show you on here, isn't it? One of the things that he's added, which is kind of like animation, actually, is you have the standard format panels, these big ones you can see here, but you'll notice that every so often, like there and there, actually on the 4 corners, here, 2, and here, there are little clusters of 4 panels. And they're like little mini animations, little mini sequences, where the picture doesn't have to be as big, and you can get a little mini sequence that goes on within them. Here, for example, she's just putting on her makeup. Bom, 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 bom. This is the stuff that that's a Chris Ware thing. He was the first person to do this, and he's done many more things than this. But it's one of the new techniques that's come into comics, where you can have these little extra moments of a little sequence that hasn't got to be told in the same size of panels. Because as you know, unlike, as far as I can think, unlike most animation where it's got to be on a screen, and the screen's your format, and it doesn't change, with comics you've got a page, you can divide the page up exactly how you like. You can do 1 page, 1 image per page, you can do dozens. It's up to you. The flexible, and the way you can play with size, with emphasis, with repetition, pattern. And the other important thing about it is, as I said, these pictures are staying on the page, but then you also inhabit the book, because you are looking through the book. And I don't know about you, but I'm a comic. You can look back to things, and you have literally got time and story in your hands to move through. You can't do this with animation. It just goes on, and then it ends. But this stuff is always here. It's fixed. It's not disappeared. You haven't got to look for a screen for it even, necessarily. So it's pretty potent stuff. Right, okay. I want to show you, this is a lovely sequence by Mazzucchelli. This book's incredible. This is a sequence, a romance sequence. What Mazzucchelli did, which nobody else had done before, and I can think of anyway, I don't think, is he gave each of his main characters their own drawing style. The style they were drawn in reflected their character. The balloon shape, the speech balloon shape, reflected how they spoke. The lettering in the balloons also conveyed how they spoke. So that rather than drawing in one style throughout, we're all different. So why aren't we drawn differently? Why don't we have different kinds of speech balloons? Because you all speak differently. So in this sequence, this is where his characters, the two characters, male and female, he's an architect, and she's a sculptress. He's drawn kind of architecturally, I guess. She's drawn like a sculpture with shading. And when they meet, their drawing styles overlap. They cross over. So they actually, in fact, not just that, as you can see on this last panel here, even the environment around, even the furniture, takes on their combined styles. We know, without even reading anything, that they are obviously falling in love, or certainly bonding, connecting, and then where their drawing styles fit together. Later in the story, when they have a row, this is the standard stance that's used by Mazzucchelli, but here they separate and they become, clearly they're not getting on, so he draws them in their separated drawing styles. That's quite a clever idea. Here, we're seeing more about the different speech balloon designs. You can see how this guy, the guy speaking here, has these big, square, emphatic speech balloons and speaks in capital letters, and often speaks over and blocks the voice of the woman. And the woman's voice is shown in upper and lower case in a kind of curved, more sort of feminine kind of approach. And here, of course, they're not getting on. They're having a row, and he's talking over her and interrupting her. In this sequence, Mazzucchelli is a really clever thing. This is where they start to fall in love again. They get back together again. And you can see here how their separate balloons are now getting closer. Not only getting closer, but the tails of the balloons here are interweaving as they're bonding, overlapping. Here, even the divide, the line separating them, is gone. And by the end, you can see that they are actually now completely in harmony again through their speech balloons. Now that's bloody brilliant, basically. And it's just one of probably countless other innovations. This medium has not finished being invented. It ought to have been, but we just keep on finding things that we'll do something new with it. That's why I'm so passionate about it, basically, because I keep finding stuff that, oh, blimey, they've done that. Right, a bit of manga. Let's talk about a bit of manga. Right, one of the things about manga is, as you may know, is that you can have fairly simplified faces. I mean, there's not many parts of this one, but this almost faces are quite simplified. But above all, they make a lot of emphasis, many manga artists make a lot of emphasis on hyper-detailed settings. And the argument behind that, we're not used to that in the West. I mean, if you draw comics, you draw them in one way, and everyone's drawn like Tintin or Asterix. It's all drawn in the kind of like, that's how it looks. But to have extremely realistic and intensely drawn settings, but not the same level of realism and intensity in the figures, seems strange to us when we first encounter manga. And the argument behind this is that we we need to feel fully immersed in the location of where the character is. But the character, him or herself, can be someone that we don't need to have drawn so hyper-realistically, so photographically. And in fact, perhaps if it's less photographic, we can identify and connect with that face, that character, more easily than if they were drawn as a very, very specific person that looks like nobody else. That's one of the arguments behind it. This is by Tezuka, who is kind of like the Disney and the Hergé and of comics and animation. He produced a lot of animation too. His page notes are very interesting. Here's one where this storyline basically includes a sequence, the sequence I'm showing you here, where a man is ill from a disease which is going to transform him into a beast, into a kind of wolf character. He's going into that hut which you saw on the previous page. Here's a page of the transformation, all the kind of writhing bodies stuff. And on the right here, a very interesting page where, how do you actually read that? What's the panel sequence going on here? Well, actually, it's almost like film strips, vertical film strips, and actually you kind of take it in as a gestalt, as a whole page, where somebody is rising and going through all sorts of transformations. In fact, that image that I showed you, the previous one there on the left, also references some classic prints from the 19th century showing sumo wrestlers. And then as the sequence ends, you have this very abstract, almost Picasso-ish kind of cubist look to the transformation, a scream. This gap is interesting. You have to remember we can do a hell of a lot with this with comics. We can make the gaps between the comics say something or mean something. That means a transition, clearly a transition. We've gone now to rain, we turn the page and woof, we're in rain. And of course manga particularly is a very flexible, it uses comics to the max basically. They will use the comics language as much as possible. And they're very innovative in terms of panel layout and shape. Here's a big zigzagging action scene showing a chase, of course, and here's finally where we see the character has this woolen mask removed and we see his horrific bestial face. Yeah, and then amongst other things that manga has also done is introduce a completely new concept we never had before in comics anywhere else, and that is bleed. You're probably aware in images that you can draw an image and will be bleed off the edge of the page, maybe at the bottom or the side, but and in the case of manga, for maximum impact, they will bleed an image right off the page. That's the edge of the page here and here. So that as you turn the comic, the only way you can really surprise somebody by reading a comic is because as soon as you open the page, your eyes are going to look down the bottom here and look ahead. We all have to when you're reading a comic, you have to sort of not look too far ahead, because otherwise it spoils it, basically. But the only way to surprise you is by going and then turn the page. And manga artists know that this is a tremendous way to get impact. I don't page spread appearing. So this one is literally suddenly you are plunged into the underwater scene with these this strange mer boy, for example. Right. Okay, I'm probably running out of time here, so I'm going to just whiz through a few examples of other kinds of comics that have been done. All kinds of interesting ones. The subject matter and style of comics has probably never been more open. And that just came up over the course of the weekend in Kendal. I interviewed several artists there, and they're all going, well, we can do what we like. We can do a 300-page graphic novel about the history of crossword puzzles. It exists, and it's bloody amazing. I mean, literally, whatever you want to do, you can do it, because now the medium is connected. There's a whole, internationally, the audience is ready for these things. And you know, the best news I had this last week, Forbes magazine did an article which said that for the first time, not the first time ever, but the first time certainly in recent memory, in America, sales of superhero comics actually are on the way down, and what's taking over are other kinds of comics, particularly graphic novels and young adult stories. The best-selling comics author in America her name is Raina Telgemeier. She has 4 graphic novels in the top 15 New York Times bestseller list of graphic novels and manga. And she has the #1 slot. Her new book is called Guts. It's about her, it's a teenage memoir, basically, of some of her health problems when she was a teenager. And it's outsold every other book, not just graphic novels. It was the biggest selling book in America in that week, maybe even since that time. And it's not a superhero. In fact, and the reasoning, people are trying to figure out why, with all these movies which you've probably all seen, these movies that keep coming out, why? Surely that means people are going to go and buy more comics, more superhero comics. They don't. Why would you? I mean, the superhero comics look pretty boring. You've got all this razzmatazz of the movie, and the movies have essentially, and TV shows, have taken over the genre of superhero and done it brilliantly. And now the medium is in decline in its print form, and that superhero is being displaced by many, many other forms of comics that are getting much more successful. That's encouraging. Documentary comic, why did the crash happen in 2008? You can understand it with this book. Darren Cunningham is a brilliant British artist who has a kind of very simple, deceptively simple style that just explains complicated things. His new book's just come out at Blake's called Billionaires, which is all about the excessive wealth and inequality of our planet too. So that's really worth checking out. There's some stuff by him. Suffragettes, this is interesting history of the suffragette movement, which enabled women to vote, as you may know, about a century ago. women weren't able to vote, and it was a struggle of women to enable that. So this is a graphic problem based on that. Artist biographies. This is Rembrandt's life story. There were some amazing life stories of comics being produced, of artists being produced in comics right now. Spectacular ones. This is one by Van Gogh, and one by Picasso. This is slightly random. There isn't very much pattern to my talk, by the way, because I realise I put this all together in rather a rush. But anyway, you're getting an impression, hopefully, of there's a lot to learn from, hopefully. This is a brilliant artist, Carol Swain, British. I used to publish her in the magazine that I ran with my partner called Escape. Carol comes from Wales, so a lot of her stories are set in Wales, this one is. And she's got this wonderful charcoal style, and very moody, very English, really quite dark. Wonderful work, one of the best artists we've had recently. Scraperboard comics, these are intensely laborious to produce, but they're beautifully done by a German artist, Lena Hoven, here doing stories about her family during the Second World War. This is Dominique Goblet, French artist who uses a multiplicity of styles in her autobiography about her complex relationship with her father. That's a beautiful one as well. Speaking of multiple styles, this artist, Carrie Fransman, actually came up with not only her own style, but 4 other styles, including using photography, and then portrayed the same story, or the same series of stories, basically, using a different fake identity. So she created a fake multiple storyline with different characters. That's a really clever approach, I think. Sean Tan, I imagine some of you must know this one. Yeah, this is an amazing book. Arrival. Is it a children's book? Is it a graphic novel? It's all those things. And he really was, for many people who don't understand the concept of visual storytelling, which is purely visual, he's the one that many people will learn a lot from, I think. And really a tremendous work. That, to me, is one of the key images, really, isn't it? The fact is that he struggles to make himself understood in this alien language. He wants to find somewhere to stay. He's a bed for the night, so he draws. And all the language that doesn't work, we can't understand any of these weird squiggles and things. The drawing is what helps him to communicate. Do you know Arrival, Sean Tan? I know a few people do, but if you don't...
It's in production here now, animated.
To be animated?
Yeah, I heard it's in pre-production now.
How wonderful.
As a feature.
Good. Well, won't be as good as the book.
True.
Very good, okay. I'm almost finished. I'm just going to talk about Richard Maguire. I was talking with people, we're not over time slightly, but I'll wrap up. Maguire, he also completely transforms the idea of comics, because you can have multiple times, literally years, within the same panel. Same location, literally. It's a corner of the room. It's this corner of the room, any corner of any room. But he chose the corner of his family home, the family living room, and he has then imagined what was happening in that corner of the room throughout thousands of years of history, and maybe into the future as well. I mean, at some point, a cat, for example, pops up, as you can see just down here. There can be little moments that it's a multiple time within an individual panel. He took this concept, you can see here, for example, he's inserted, at some point, 1860, there was a cow going through here, through the living room with all these women sitting around, for example. And he took that idea and expanded it in this bonkers mind map here he made into this thing called Here, which is an extraordinary graphic novel which uses literally the corner of the room is the corner of the book. So every time you're opening a spread, you're seeing the corner of the room, the same viewpoint throughout, but as it goes on, more dates and more storylines and connections start to appear. So, for example, there we have from 8000 BC. Clearly, there wasn't much going on back then. There was lots of marsh and swampland, and that's the same location that these people are now living in now, in the corner of their house. But he goes on, and there's a bicycle in the living room because that was from 10,000 BC. And as the book goes on, it's about a 200-page book with these spreads. The connections you can start to follow. But from the dates, the stories that interweave throughout this book. Because if you follow the dates, you find them through the book, you can see, okay, that's how that works. So it's a multiple storyline, multi-cursal. This actually is the way the comics can also go. Because they're fixed on the page, it's not A to B, it's not linear, it's not animation. because animation can't do this. I don't think. Maybe you can do it. Maybe you should do it. I don't know. But with comics, if it's fixed, we can move around. We can go back to an earlier page. Of course you can. And we can explore further ahead, and we can find links like dates or whatever other connections there are within the pages of a comic. And this is what Maguire's doing here. It's like many things. It's an incredibly ambitious and revelatory innovation, which isn't necessarily something that you can go, okay, I'm going to do that, but you could learn from this as well. It might be a way to develop your storytelling and imagine that. Multi-cursal, multi-path comics. I was first involved with these back in 2003 when I set up the Comic Festival at the ICA in London, and we had a big one on a wall here with about 25 artists all contributing connected stories, like a big kind of grid of stories. This is a multi-path comic done by David McKean, who's another incredibly important comic artist, British of course, worked with Neil Gaiman famously. Here he imagines a storyline where the same incident is portrayed from 3 points of view. It's an attack in a park, and you have 3 viewpoints. You have the aggressor, you have the victim, and you have a witness. And you follow those 3 parallel stories initially as they branch off here. That's one story, another one goes off in different directions. And then in the later part of the exhibition, in the middle of the room, he has these masks. You can see them just here. And as you look through the eyes of the 3 masks, you are literally inside the head of each of the character. Again, the victim, the attacker, the witness. But as adults, looking back and trying to remember what happened and how it affected them. And this kind of trompe-l'oeil thing, which obviously is a real jumble, if you stand exactly in the right place and look through the mask, it all comes into focus and you can read the perspective. So it's 3 stories, and it's a gallery comic. In fact, this is something which is really big right now. The weekend there was a bunch of Spanish artists who've just done some incredible gallery comics. In other words, it's not planned for print. Print doesn't matter. You make it for the space, you make it site-specific, and you can involve sculpture, you can involve the reader literally moving around, exploring within the graphics. It's a great concept, I think, that's going to, again, be another future for comics. Digital, very briefly. Meanwhile, maybe you know Jason Shiger's book and graphic novel, where he gives you multiple choices, probably thousands of variations. What you do basically is each choice you make directs you to a different, in this case, different tab. There's obviously an iPad version of this as well. And then you turn the page and you can follow the story, and it gives multiple directions. That image, by the way, in the background is how he planned out the entire comic. And he's been working on one. He said, I was in touch with him most recently, doing a new one. As you can say, it's going to take me about a year to do the maths. And this guy's just bonkers, fantastically bonkers, but doing incredible things with comics. And webcomics, Webtoons, South Korea, biggest market in the world. If you don't want to read print, you haven't looked at the book perhaps in ever or anymore, then they're all on your phone. And vertical scrolling webtoons are fascinating, huge form right now. They're the biggest market for comics in Korea and elsewhere. It's growing. Well, it stretches the medium in exciting ways. What it tends to do when they're done properly, in my opinion, is that they're not just a page of comic that's just put onto a screen. They are formatted to work as a vertical scrolling effect, and you can use the space between the panels in inventive ways. You can also, of course, stretch images. Sometimes you can have somebody falling off a building, and it will just go on and on for quite a long time. People in Korea are reading these around 20 minutes a day, and they're usually getting around at least 10 or 11 different episodes. And these people, it's huge. And exciting to see what that is doing. At the same time, it's got limits, because what we've got here is that every panel is shown separately. You've got none of that beautiful layout of the page that I was showing you earlier. But on the plus side, every panel can be a surprise, because you can't see ahead. So it gives you a great energy to the storytelling. And that's just some facts about Webtoons, which are huge. And I'm going to end, I think this is my last image now. This is an example of other inventions. Comics are never going to be finished being inventive, because after all, as I said earlier, it's words and it's pictures. We could do a hell of a lot with both, with each of those things, put them together, and there's no limit to what you can do. And this is a really interesting Indian comic made drawn by 2 indigenous artists, folk artists, who had never made comics before. It's about Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, who is a famous untouchable. You may have heard about untouchables in India. They are the lowest of the low. They are below dogs. You cannot touch them. Anything they touch, it becomes tainted. And we're in 2019, and there is still a very strong caste system there, no matter what you might say about her in India. And there are still attacks on untouchables. Ambedkar was an untouchable himself. He managed to, in the early part of the 20th century, he was able to elevate himself, get a law degree, etc. So he was an inspiring person, showing how an untouchable could be actually successful and make a life of his own. Anyway, when they showed these two artists comics, they showed them all the stuff I've shown you, basically. I said, well, we don't really like that. We don't like boxes. We don't want to put people in boxes. We don't do that. And they came up, well, we'd like to separate the panels, we want to use things that come out from our folk art. And the folk art we use includes these kind of decorative friezes that are put along the outsides of houses or on walls, which are made from clay. The clay changes according, and the patterns changing according to the time of year. And so that's how they divide the panels. And there's actually, we want to use different ways of drawing the speech balloons. So for example, here you can see how a speech balloon here is in the shape of a bird. The tail of the speech balloon has a bird on it. But then over here, for a thought balloon, they put an eye inside the thought balloon, because that's the mind's eye. And finally, because this story is about untouchables, a lot of the things that people are saying to untouchables, or about untouchables, is pretty nasty. They're saying some nasty stuff. So, brilliantly, they just came up with a very simple solution. They drew a scorpion tail as the tail of the balloon. So, this to me, I sort of thought, well, yes, of course, they've come up with things that no one's done before. They've done new ways of doing the comics. It shows that this medium is really, really wide open. So that's it. Thank you. We have, I've stretched it a bit, sorry, thanks for your patience. So, you want lunch, but do you want to have any questions you want to ask now? Go ahead.
In history, when...
I have a bit as well, by the way.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
In history, when comic artists have done graphic novels, do they usually start with a storyboard?
That's an interesting question. Let me think about this. Yeah, quite a lot of them do. In fact, if you went to Lakes, you would see an exhibition of Hellboy. You know Hellboy, the movies? Yeah, and that has the whole breakdown of how the writer happens to be a writer working with an artist. The writer is a comic artist too. They will plan out a storyboard. They will do what they call thumbnails. They'll figure out which panel's going to be which side, the format of the page. And there's very often there is a script has to be worked out as well. People would very often, they tend to write and draw at the same time. They'll think about dialogue, they'll think about, but there's not one way of doing it. So it's not like there's a formula that everybody does. It's quite individual. But you have to do some planning. You can't just kind of, you could, of course artists do, just draw top left and just keep going with no plan as to what's happening on the page or across the spread. But essentially the unit of the comic really isn't even a page or a panel, it's the spread. That spread, because that spread is the thing that the reader sees. You need to be thinking always in terms of how you take the reader through the page, direct them, and that so they can easily follow what's happening, see the transitions, and then think about the pacing so that you know that when you turn the page, something else is bringing you forward through the story. And this is why manga, actually, Japanese comics are so effective, because they really know how to do that, yeah.
What softwares do we use to do that storyboards?
I don't know that they're necessarily using a lot of software. I'm sure there are some. A lot of it's just drawing, just stuff on paper. And what I've seen from talking to manga artists, a lot of them will just draw the simplest possible sketches, just on an A4 page, folded in half, and draw it in pencil and get it as rough. It doesn't have to be clear in terms of finished drawing. You just need to get the ideas down, saying, is this working? And one of the strengths of manga, which we don't have very much in the West, is they have very hands-on editors at the publishing companies who will actually question an artist and take them through the story and say, that doesn't work, change that, because they want to make sure that the story is absolutely clear and also absolutely makes the most emotional impact on the reader. So, but there probably are softwares. I'm not really up on the softwares. There must be manga studio and these various kind of things that are around, but that might help you. Yeah. Yes, hello.
Do you prefer black and white or color?
Sorry?
Do you prefer black and white or color?
I'm easy with either. Yeah, I don't mind about that. I think quite a lot of things. I think V for Vendetta, for example, that the Guy Fawkes comic I showed you, that originally appeared in black and white, and that's how it was intended to appear. It had to be put into colour because it became an American comic book. And the artist and many other people also feel that really the black and white version was better than the colour. Black and white's beautiful, of course. Yeah. What, did you have a preference?
Black and white is better.
Yes, I think. Oh yeah. But then there are artists who use colour so spectacularly. And colour, of course, is a whole other register, a whole other way of communicating a story. So it's worth thinking about using it. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else like to ask something? Yeah, hello. Let me think. My most recent favourite probably is two. One I like is called Inuyashiki. You know that one? There's a movie of it, which is crap, of course, it's a movie. But it's really extreme, isn't it? Have you read Inuyashiki? It's the one about an old guy who gets reconstructed and him being killed by aliens and comes back with as a nasty teenager. Yeah, it's just really, it's tremendous, I think, tremendous. And guilty pleasure. The other one I really like is it's called A Bride's Story, which is set in like the 19th century. It's on the Silk Road, set out in Turkey and that kind of thing. And fantastic drawing, and just this artist, woman artist, is just taking all the time she wants to convey the atmosphere and the characters. It's just wonderful. Yeah.
How long does it take to do each page of a comic?
These are questions that I think probably you'll find it's not easy to answer, because there's no one standard. I mean, if you ask an animator how long does it take to make an animation, I don't think they would give you one answer. It takes what it takes. I'm sorry, I'm not giving you the answer you might want, but there isn't actually a formula to this, or a one-size-fits-all. Sorry, yes, go ahead, sir. Yeah.
Saying pages in manga, have you ever heard of Akira?
Of course, yeah. That's an essential one. Yeah, we've got that in the Manga-Asia exhibition. Yeah, that's incredible. What's good about that, of course, is it was Otomo Katsuhiro was able to make the anime himself, which doesn't always happen. Have an art like Rajan Satrapi, essentially, being able to take her or his comic and make it into an animated film themselves, so that the vision is kept true to the film version. Yeah, and of course, also what happened there, I think, is that he hadn't finished doing the Akira comic, the manga wasn't finished. So he had to make an ending for the movie, and then went back to making the comic and gave it a different and more extended narration at the end. And yeah, that's a masterpiece, of course. Yeah, very good one. Yeah.
I think we should wrap it up.
I think we should wrap it up,
Yeah,
shall we?
yeah.
Yeah, it's good. But thank you for
the
your
people in year
interest.
3, they're doing the graphic
Yeah.
novel. We meet at about 2:30 in room 15. And Paul's around after 2:30, and I'll get him back to the train station about 3:15.
Thank you for your patience. I know I talked far too much. Sorry about that. Thank you.